Hi, Joe.
Hey, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you today?
Oh, not bad. It's super hot in Nashville, so I'm trying to stay indoors.
Yeah. So before we get into some kind of more technical stuff, maybe could you start by telling us how you came to work with Ben Folds and kind of a bit about your career over time?
Yeah, well, first off, I'm originally from Massachusetts, and I moved to Nashville in 1993, and I had actually worked at a studio in Boston while I lived there called Synchro Sound. It had been it'd been used to be owned by the Cars, and so I worked there for a couple years. And when I moved to Nashville, I just kind of started again. I didn't really know many people here, so I started, interning and assisting. And I started at a couple studios. One was Treasure Isle, and one was House of David, and they're both still here. And I met a couple of engineers. One was Tom Harding, and another one was Joe Baldridge. And I started working kind of with them more exclusively, but I also would get hired by the studios as well to assist and engineer. And so as time went on, it was mid to late '90s, early 2000s, and I was doing more engineering and less assisting. And I had a mutual friend. I still have this mutual friend. His name is John Painter, and he used to work a lot with Ben. And Ben had just gotten RCA Studio A. He had just leased the space and basically put a console in and had it wired. And he told me, he said, I've been doing some engineering for Ben, but he's going to need somebody that could be there more often because John does a lot of stuff. He does arranging and producing and all that kind of stuff, and he can play 1,000 instruments. So he just has a lot going on. So he introduced me to Ben, and then I just kind of started working with him. I would say maybe around 2002, somewhere in there, 2003. He was just starting to record. He had done 3 EPs around that time, and he was just starting to work on those EPs. So he was basically playing all the instruments himself. And yeah, that's when I met him and I started going over there, and then we just kind of did stuff all the time. Basically, he always had something going on. So that's long story of how I met Ben.
Great. Just to get into the kind of geekier side of it, obviously when a lot of people think of Ben, they think of piano. What are some of
Yeah.
your favorite ways of recording piano? And has it kind of changed per album or has it kind of stayed the same a lot?
Well, it depends. With Ben, I do something fairly standard with any piano, and if it's going to be stereo, um, I prefer large diaphragm condensers. With Ben, we would try. He's very involved with the recording process, and he likes to try all kinds of things. But our sort of quote unquote standard thing we would do is he had these Neumann CMV 563 microphones, and they have the M7 capsule and their tube mics. I don't know what year they are, from the '60s at some point. And so I would do a pair of those and always stick my head in the piano just to sort of hear where all the energy is coming from. I don't like just to do low and high because sometimes people are playing, they never play up in the upper register, so you have kind of a lopsided stereo image. So I just stick my head in there and just see kind of what's going on, and I'll space my mics that way. But that being said, Ben has his own particular sound. It's the way his piano sounds, the way he plays. I mean, he plays his chord choices, his voicings. He's a hard player. He's the only piano player that I know of that I've worked with personally that breaks piano strings. So he's like extremely forceful. So he has his own tone on a piano, and he had this particular Steinway B that sounded fantastic. And it's funny, I've heard him on other pianos, and the piano just, no pun intended, it just would fold up under him because he's just, the way he hits, it just wouldn't respond to him. So he's got his own sound himself. And so the combination of his type of piano and his playing would lend itself to, a spaced, large diaphragm kind of Neumann variety microphone. But with other players, it's interesting. It just depends. Some players play lighter. and then sometimes I'm working on pianos that are really bright. And so, I'll switch over to ribbons instead. So I don't know. It kind of depends on the player and all that. But with Ben, that was kind of like our standard thing. Every once in a while, he'd want to try something else, But basically, we would just kind of stick to that and get going.
You mentioned he would play a lot of the instruments himself. Did you have a kind of standard working kind of way where he would start with a particular instrument and then go along to kind of another standard one? Or
yeah, well, on those EPs, he would be his own rhythm section. He's an amazing. A lot of people don't know this, but he was actually a percussionist drummer first before piano. So that was kind of his main instrument. He's a fantastic drummer, and he's an amazing bass player too. I think he was a gigging bass player at some point. But yeah, what he would, just depending on the song, sometimes he would just start with drums, and a lot of times he wouldn't even use a click. His timing is excellent. So sometimes he would just start playing drums and then put a piano on top of it, and then quickly put a bass, and then realize, oh, you know what, it needs to be slower. Let me just start again. And then he'd kind of go in circles. Sometimes he'd start with the piano part and then do drums to it, and then bass. And then he would say, oh, I'm playing too much on the piano, so let me redo that. And then I can, let's mute the bass for now because that's not going to make any sense. So he would kind of just go in circles either way. It would either start with piano or drums, depending on what mood he was in. And finally, he'd get a rhythm track that he was cool with. Sometimes he'd put a vocal on top of it, and then realize that something wasn't right, and we'd start all again. So sometimes it would be a day or two later, and we'd just re-record it all again. But yeah, it would go either direction until he got it, and usually no click.
Were you working on Pro Tools at this point, or was it still tape?
Let's see, it was tape. He had a Studer 800 when I started working with him, and that morphed into a Radar for a while. And so we did, his 3 EPs were on Radar, and the Songs for Silverman album was on Radar, and he produced a William Shatner record that we did in RCA Studio A, and that was on Radar. And I think we moved over to Pro Tools. Let's see, we moved over to Pro Tools. He did he did some songs for a DreamWorks movie called Over the Hedge, and that's when we switched over to Pro Tools. But before that, I worked a lot on Radar for a few years. There was a small window where we went from the Studer 800 to Radar, and then it was Radar for like a few years at least.
What was the kind of standard drum recording that you were doing with him?
Oh, again, he would want to try all kinds of stuff. And in fact, RCA Studio A is a pretty big room, but it doesn't, I heard someone explain it once, and they're completely right. It's almost like you're playing outside. It doesn't give you a lot back, but it's a big space, but it's not completely dead either. So we would try stuff, just placement, middle of the room, off to one side in the room, under there's like if you've ever see photos, or like there's some ISO booths, and there's stairs that go over the ISO booths, and then the stairs go kind of like, it's like a little bridge, and it goes to a door upstairs. And so we'd put the drums kind of under that bridge to kind of give some reflection. And then a lot of times towards the end, we ended up just putting them in the drum booth because they were pretty dead, but they sounded cooler in the track. But sometimes it would be, let's see, there were times I would do a pair of Neumann M582s with the Omni capsule, and that we did that on the Shatner record. And when you're playing super lightly, and not necessarily super lightly, but it gives you a lot of definition with the overheads, and being out in that room, even though that room, it kind of made the room shine in the overheads a bit. So, I chose Omnis. I don't usually use Omnis on overheads, but we would try that. And he may have even said, hey, let's try those. Nothing fairly complicated, like some sort of like a Beta 52 or a D112 in the kick, and The 57 on the snare and 421s on the toms, and pair of rim mics would have been a pair of Omni something, whatever. But different. Yeah, I mean, on the So There record, I did a mono overhead with that. It was just always something different. Sometimes I would just use some Coles for the overheads. And a lot of times he would just be kind of like what mood he was in. So we would try. He'd say like, I think this drum, this drum sound should be kind of ribbony. So okay. And he also had a Collins, tube radio sort of console that was modified, and I know there was one project where he's like, I want to try putting the drums all through that. So we did that, and that was cool. So it's like it's kind of like stream of consciousness, just kind of whatever. No really standard thing.
Did you generally leave things set up if he was kind of moving quickly between different instruments for every song?
Yeah, especially when it was his own private studio, we would just leave things. I would never really break. I would only break things down if it was going to be, he was going to be gone for a while and maybe there was going to be something completely new that we were going to do. But other than that, yeah, I would leave like drum kit set up and piano with mics on them and U47 in the middle of the room somewhere. And, his tack piano, I would leave that mic'd up and a bass set up. So yeah, because he likes to move fast when he's coming up with stuff. So that's the best way to keep things moving.
Could you think about a time where you used the least amount of mics on the drum kit?
Let's see. Least amount. Oh, probably. I'm trying to remember. It probably was the So There record, and it was probably. I'm trying to remember which song it was. It might have been the song called So There. He ended up playing drums on it. I think it might have been I've been really liking the Mic Tech CB3s on overheads, and I had just gotten one of them and I wanted to try it, and it sounded great as a mono overhead. I think it was, I could be wrong, but I think it was just that and a kick drum mic, and I may have had a snare drum mic, probably didn't use it, and like a rim mic far away. And he mixes himself when he plays drums so well that you could really get away with not much of anything.
Have you noticed any big differences in the recording and the kind of mixing process if you're just doing it like that with Ben, kind of one thing at a time, compared to if you're doing like a full band thing there all in the room?
It just depends. I mean, different people play differently. I know that he's really great about arrangement, so usually the mixes, it's usually easy to mix, and when he would, this is a while ago, so it's been a while since he's played everything, but I do remember it being like extra easy to mix because he gets a great drum tone. Like I said, he mixes himself. He gets a great bass tone. His piano sounds cool. Everything just kind of fits, and he knows, especially when he's playing piano, he knows that if he's playing too much on the low end, it's going to be a nightmare to mix, and he'll even think of that ahead of time, and he's even said that before. He says, I'm being a jackass, and basically I don't need to play that much in the low end, and that's going to be a pain for you to mix, so let me go back out and fix that, and he'll do it. And he's right, and it's just I can throw up the faders pretty quick. So, but even the band stuff, the band he had after Ben Folds 5, they all sounded great, and the arrangements were always great. They'd always work them out, and then the reunion record we did with Ben Folds 5, that's a different sound, and they play differently, but yet that was fairly easy to mix too because it would just all the arrangements are worked out. The intensity is different with that band, but still, it's all cool,
If you're moving quickly like that, were you processing on the way in, or were you generally leaving it for later?
I still like to process on the way in. I like to try to get my sound as close as possible. That I don't have to do so much when I'm mixing. I like with drums. I don't like to super brighten them unless we're going for something like that. I mean, I like to get them kind of natural and cool sounding where I'm happy with them, knowing later that I may amp them up a little bit or maybe brighten them a little bit. But I do try to get them like at least halfway there to where if it just sat there, it would be totally cool, and I could leave the option for later. When I'm working on tape, I go for it a lot more because especially on tape, the high end will start going away. The more you do overdubs, and so I can actually. It's funny. I don't do stuff on tape much anymore, but I have done a couple records on tape in the past couple years, and I had to rearrange my thinking again because I actually would cut things a little brighter, especially drums, to tape, because even the next day it mellows out. So I know I can get away with just an extra click of like, okay, I know this sounds a little bright going down, but you start working on it the next day and it's like, it's perfect, and it kind of leaves you less room for a ton of, you won't have as much noise to deal with, although people like noise now, so maybe it's not that big of a deal.
What are some of your favorite bass recording methods?
Well, there's a few ways. I always take a DI, and there's usually a bass amp involved, and if it's more of a standard bass amp, like like a B15 or a B12 or some other SVT or something like that, when it comes time to, I'll take both, try to figure out the phase, because the phase is never quite, sometimes it could be one or the other depending on the way you're going to mix it. And if I am mixing it, I usually will choose one or the other. I won't use both because it never feels right to mix both in for me. That being said, lately I've been taking a DI and then not using a standard bass amp. But lately, there's been a couple of projects where I've been using this little tiny, it's like a Marshall solid state. Like, it's small. I can't. The speaker might even be like a 10 or something like that. I don't know, but it breaks up in a cool way, and you can get it to fuzz out. And that I will combine with the DI, because that's just adding some harmonic distortion. So that's cool. I did try one technique once that I heard from Andy Johns on some sort of interview I was watching. It was actually really cool, and I'm going to start using it again. I tried it once, and it's awesome. And if you take the DI, and if you can, with your bass amp, if you're in some sort of a room where you can do this, use a mic that you can put in figure 8, whether it's a ribbon or it's a condenser that you can select figure 8, and back it off from the amp. I don't know, 4 or 5 feet, I think. And I think I did about 4. Yeah, it was about that, 4 or 5 feet. And this way you'll be able to combine it with your DI, and it won't have any phasing issues. Now, the times I have done that, I've had to flip it out of phase because it's been 180 degrees out. But it doesn't cause that strange little, kind of 90 degree out of phase timing issue. And it'll sound kind of weird on its own. It won't sound great. You kind of bring it up. It could sound, I don't know, but it's like, it's not meant to be by itself. But when you do mix it in with the DI, it does give that harmonic dimension to it without causing any phasing. So I've only done that once or twice, and that's been a couple years now. And that's a good way to combine them if you want. But I mean, usually it's just like, it's one or the other for me. And, sometimes the DI is awesome. Sometimes the amp is the way to go. And, I'll just kind of pick one.
I think that figure 8 technique was quite a common Beatles one as well later on.
Yeah, it's really, I saw this interview and I thought, that's pretty cool. And I happened to be working on something in the next week that I was able to do that. I had I think I had it isolated good enough, or another room, I can't quite remember. I was like, let me try this, and I backed it off, and the bass player was like, whoa, what is that? And I was like, it's like a technique I just heard about. So totally cool. Yeah.
Working in a big room like that, were you generally just using the room ambience for a lot of your kind of depth, or were you relying on other reverbs as well?
If we were close miking, it would be other reverbs. There's a song. Let's see. I'm trying to think of the name of it. It was for a movie, and it was called. It starred Alicia Witt, and it was called Cold. I think it was called Cold Turkey. I think it was. But they did. Her and Ben did a duet, and it was the theme for the movie, and that was one of the ones where he wanted to try that Collins tube console. The Collins tube console, the way it's set up, it's from the 50s and it's meant for ribbon mics. So they have a bunch of big knobs, but the knobs are basically attenuators. You crank it all the way up, it's zero, it's unity. And the mic pre's are fixed. I think it's like 50 or 60 dB a gain. So later on, when we started using that, I started using selectable pads, so you could actually use, you can get your mics close. But at the time, we didn't have that. And he said, well, let's try this drum kit with this stuff. So I really had to back the mics off quite a bit to make it work. But the side effect was it gave the room dimension got sucked in to the sounds of everything. So in that case, it really was awesome. You were forced in a way to record that way. And the byproduct was that it just, the room dimension sounded awesome. So that room in particular, you could get away with a lot because you could really back things off. It wasn't a very live room, but it was a beautiful sounding room. So you could back things off. You could have a singer out there with a ribbon mic. You could hear bits of the room, but it sounded pleasing. I would never really cut vocals out there with any kind of baffles because I didn't mind that I could hear some of the room in there because it just added to it. So in some ways, yeah, you would get the dimension of it. And other times, there'd be closed mic stuff. So I might add little bits of reverb here and there.
Maybe what about acoustic guitars? It's kind of some of your favorite mic techniques.
I don't do stereo. It's usually mono, and depends on the situation. I really love the Mic Tech CV3. It's got a high end sort of lift kind of built into it that sounds really smooth, so I don't feel like I don't have to EQ anything. And in that particular mic, especially if you're doing an acoustic vocal, that particular mic, when you put it in figure eight, on the null points of the figure eight, it almost completely goes away. It's awesome. It's kind of like a 414 in that way, where you can just I would use that on an acoustic guitar and point the figure eight null point at the person's mouth, and then put like an SM7 or something like that up there, and you can almost hear basically the vocal in the acoustic mic, which is usually your problem. It almost sounded kind of like headphone bleed, which is kind of nice. And it's just a good sounding mic. I mean, there's stuff like that. I just did a record recently where I used an M160, the Beyer M160 on the acoustic guitar, and it sounded fantastic. Let's see. Yeah, that just nothing really crazy. It's either a ribbon or a condenser, and sometimes a 57's nice if you have a bunch of. I did a project once on one song where they kind of wanted everyone in the room doing this one song, and it was drums and like 3 acoustic guitars and this sort of thing. And I was like, well, I know 2 of these acoustic guitars are going to get 57s, and it was great. They sounded awesome, and the drums didn't fly into the acoustic as much as it would have with a condenser. So that's a great sound too. But yeah, nothing too earth shattering.
What are some of your kind of most used EQs for tracking?
API, 560Bs, and I've just gotten into these Cush Audio EQs, and I'm spacing on the name of them. In fact, I actually have them right here. They are called, as I look at let's see here. That's how new they are to me, Electras. And I just got a pair of those, and they're absolutely amazing. They, when you do any kind of EQ adjustments, it almost feels like you've moved the mic to a better position rather than just kind of corrected it with EQ. So I was trying them out, and one of the thing I was working on, the inside bass drum mic had like almost no low end to it, and I was like, well, let me try this EQ on this thing, and I cranked all the low end, and it sounded like I adjusted something on the drum. It almost sounded like we used a different bass drum, or I tuned it a little differently, or I pulled some of the padding out. It didn't sound like I added a ton of EQ to something that didn't have that low end. So it's very interesting EQ, and I'm still kind of getting used to them because I haven't heard anything like that before. But so that's sort of a new thing for tracking, but I'm so used to API stuff. It's 560Bs, 550As, basically, and some of the Neve stuff occasionally. 1073s, it's cool, but I usually have API stuff in front of me, so I'm most used to that from growing up around API stuff.
What are some of your most used compressors generally?
Of course, 1176 and LA2As, and I have a pair of LA3As that I love, and that's sort of the deal. And I love distressors, and I think that's, unless I'm forgetting something. That I've been getting into the Spectrasonics compressor lately, and I don't usually compress drum stuff when I'm tracking. Sometimes, usually the room, I'll do the rooms or something that I want to really be affected that I can bring in and really, change the dimension of the sound. But the individual mics, I don't. I'm just not, it's something I don't do. But there have been a couple projects where I have used a mono overhead, like a U67, and I always paired that with a Spectrasonic 610 and just kind of tapping it, and it's pretty amazing. So I don't own one of those, but I have a friend who has a pair of them. He actually has 5 of them, and that there's a pair in a rack that I basically borrow. If he's not using them, I can just use them. So I actually have been getting around those pretty well, and there's nothing like those either. So they're kind of fun to work with. I learn something new about them every time I use them.
Are you using them in the kind of super fast mode that they're known for, or more kind of laid back?
I've been using them lately. I've just been using them in the super fast where the slope is all the way to the right. I've been that's where I've been. I started with the slope sort of, I don't know, 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock, somewhere in there. And that felt nice to me. And that's, you're kind of like quote unquote normal compression, but there's something about just the super fast mode and doing I guess it does like a low ratio when you're all the way to the right. And that sounds awesome to me. So that's whenever I'm using them now, it's sort of, that's my go-to. And I start that at that point.
Hey everyone, this episode of the podcast is sponsored by Tonalux and their brand new JC37 microphone. This is a clone of the old Sony C37A tube microphone designed with producer Joe Costa, who was on episode 5 of the podcast. The original Sony mics were used on sessions with people like Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, and the Wrecking Crew. In my opinion, these new Tonalux microphones are great for people with small studios and home studios looking to invest in one really great tube condenser mic. Unlike a lot of tube condenser microphones, these Tonalux mics are incredibly versatile, can be used on guitar amps, snare, kick drum, drum overheads, vocals, and almost anything that in a lot of situations a normal tube microphone couldn't handle the sound pressure of. And because you can get these microphones right up close to a lot of sources, they're great for recording in ideal spaces, which is what I do a lot of, as I have a portable recording studio. And another great thing about them is, even though they're hand-assembled in the USA, these mics are a lot cheaper than a lot of classic tube microphones as well. You can get a pair of them for the same price that you could get a single tube microphone from a lot of other manufacturers. Please visit tonalux.com/product/JC37 to see more information about them. Thanks for listening, and now back to the episode. Do you use plugins much?
Yeah, I've UA. I mix in the box mostly now. So, yeah, I mean, I have my UA stuff, and I really love. There's a company called Rare Signals, and they have a plugin called the Transatlantic Plate, and it's the best plate reverb plugin I've ever heard. It sounds like a real plate. I mean, I can almost see the metal vibrating. There's two plate models. One is a Lawson, and one is an EMT. And the guy who has the company, Brian Charles, he's from Boston. He owns the Lawson, so he's sampled. I don't know how they do it, but he sampled that. And the Lawson, it's the one he owns. And then the EMT, I think, was the one that was in Bearsville Studios. and he does it differently than everybody else. And I don't know the process, but he doesn't. There's selectable reverb times, and I think those are all sampled by themselves individually. I don't think there's any fudge factor between times. It's like that's, if it's 1.2, that's the time it was sampled at 1.2, and then you move to 1.6 or 2.3. That's the time it was sampled, and it sounds fantastic. I mean, I'm pretty blown away. I use it all the time.
What does your two-bus normally look like?
Two-bus, I like to have the back CQ. It was one of my first things, and I don't use it for. I do love the EQ sound on it, but I use it more for the cuts. I cut off about, I don't know the numbers. I think it's like 23 hertz and 70K. To me, when I chop off those, everything seems more in focus. So I start with that, and then I use UA SSL G-Bus compressor, which is fantastic. I own the hardware piece, and when I first got into UA, they didn't have the updated SSL. They had the first version, but even the first version, I mean, I set my settings back and forth between the hardware and the software, and I honestly could not tell the difference. So, and then they updated it to the newer version with like the sidechain and all that. So, but that's the one I use. That comes next, and I used to use the ATR 102 plug, and I have my own alignment settings. So depending on tape and speed, I've kind of made my own presets of my own alignments. But lately, instead of that, I've been using the Crane Song Phoenix 2. I've been really, really, really enjoying that. So that's become my tape emulation on my 2 mix. And then let's see. I usually have a few things kind of inactive because it's just choices. But usually after that, it's an Oxford inflator, and I think that's it. But before the inflator, I'll have a Mag EQ4 ready to go just in case I feel like the whole thing needs to be brighter, or any dads, the whole thing could use a little bit of sub. I really love that EQ. Yeah, and then the inflator, and I think that's it. If there's some distortion with the inflator, every once in a while there's a weird little thing that happens with, like, I don't know if it's intermodulation distortion, but if that's the case, then I can put it in split band mode, and that will usually go away. The problem with that is now you'll start getting output peaks because it treats the signal differently. So if that's the case and I want to keep the same type of loudness, then I'll throw some sort of limiter on the back end of that. And I don't limit too much. I just, it's usually like at the most a dB. It's usually like, half a dB here and there. It's just to catch those errant peaks that the inflator is letting through in that mode. And if it's not in that mode, then I don't need a limiter after that because it's already it's like plenty loud. I don't need it to be louder than that. And I think that's it.
What are some of your favorite electric guitar mics and techniques?
57's always great. I usually like to stick with one mic. I have a producer friend that loves the multiple mic thing, so I'll do that and bust them together, and that's cool too. I don't, it's definitely awesome. But I kind of like to, if it's like left up to me, I like to just pick one and just be done with it. 57s are always great. I like the sides of the cone better, or doing like a 45-degree angle on the cone. I like the low end of that. I usually don't like to go right down the dust cap, but so I'll kind of move whatever mic I'm using over to the side, unless it's a ribbon. A ribbon I'll put over the dust cap because it'll chill it out. But so yeah, there's times where it's just a 57. There are times where I will go ahead and do a 57 and a Royer 121, and I'll bust them together. If I'm on a console, if I'm somewhere where it's like a bunch of mic pre's and no console, I'll make a choice, or I'll either record them both and then, sum them together later. But But yeah, I like to bust that together and maybe put an 1176 on that. And there are times where a condenser is kind of cool. There was a project recently I did at Sound Emporium Studios, and there was two electric guitar players playing live, and they've got these 87s that are Fred Cameron 87s. Fred Cameron was he's passed away, but he was someone who he modified microphones, and these are hot rodded 87s. They're tube 87s, and so and these seem to be a little darker from what I remember. So I put them on, in front of each amp, and they sounded absolutely fantastic. And let me think. It's kind of it's like 1, 2. Sometimes it's just a single ribbon mic, and if I can get away with it, and it's the kind of song that warrants it, I'll back it up quite a bit. There was a project we did where I took a Royer and just basically backed up the Royer, I don't know, 3 feet from the amp or something like that, and it sounded fantastic. It was just the amp was in its own room, and it was a fairly dead room, and it was nice to give the mic some actual space. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else crazy, but no, that's about it. It's sort of like just project dependent, I guess. Oh, there is I completely forgot about it. I keep mentioning Mic Tech because I love their stuff, and they have a dynamic mic called a PM10, and I'll bring that with me. It's got a 57 quality to it, but it sounds a little more 3-dimensional. And I put it up next to a 57 on a guitar amp, and it's pretty amazing. It's the 57 sounds great. It sounds like a 57. And then you bring up the PM10, and it has that quality, but it's almost like it steps forward out of the speakers a little bit, and not in an EQ way. It just kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better description, it sounds kind of 3-dimensional. So I've been actually, if I can remember to bring that with me, wherever I'm going to be, I'll usually throw that on an electric guitar.
I think the last thing we haven't covered is vocals. What are some of your kind of favorite vocal mics?
Well, it's funny. It's like whatever works on the vocalist. It's an SM7 is always that's been the mic that seems to always work on somebody. If you've got to do something fast, it's always cool. I've had it beat out gazillion-dollar microphones on vocals. It just depends. Everyone is so different with vocals. I mean, I had access with Ben's 47, which is a fantastic 47, and for him it sounded awesome. And sometimes you get someone in front of it and it would sound awful. It's like, but then you'd put an SM7 in front of them and it would sound fantastic. So it's just I'll if I don't know the singer and I don't know how they're gonna you set up a few mics, SM7, a fancy tube mic, and maybe just a regular old condenser like a 414, and just see what fits in the track. Some people have this harmonic distortion that comes out of their mouth. I mean, so I've had I've been recording, I've recorded people, or you're trying to get a sound on them. It's like, what is that? And you go out and listen to them. It's like, oh, that's coming out of your mouth. Okay. So, this tube mic is not helping that, it's just sounding like it's getting, it's accentuating that harmonic distortion. So that might not be the thing. We might need something more, just in the condenser solid state thing, or just, again, dynamic. It's just, that's always the wild card, because it just, you just never know what someone's going to do. I'm working with this band now, and I've been using an SM7 on him, and he sounds great. And on that, and we went somewhere and they had the new reissue 67, and I was like, oh, cool, let's try that. And put them next to each other, and it sounded awful on him. It just really, it's just no focus, no nothing, and he went in front of the SM7 and it poked out of the track like it should, and it sounded awesome. So that's what we went with. So that's always a good mic to have around for a lot of reasons. and vocal is one of them.
Are you generally fussy about preamps?
No, I mean, as long as it's good. I'm so used to API stuff that to me, it's just like that just sounds awesome. And it's got a great tone, very cool. I love the Neve stuff. I have a 3124 set of 4 API mic pre's from the 90s, and if I'm somewhere that doesn't have anything great, I'll bring those. But yeah, it's generally like, it's going to come down to the way the person sings in the microphone, and it doesn't need to be anything super fancy. I think I'm happy to if it's easier and the console sounds cool, even if it's I'd rather have things in front of me. There could be some cool preamps hanging around, and it's an SSL, and it's like, there have been times where it's like, let's just track everything through the SSL drums. I mean, I just want to have everything in front of me. If I need to EQ something, it's right there, and it sounds awesome. It doesn't. I'm not saying it's good preamps are. It's not important, but I just don't. I don't get too fussy about it. I try not to, anyway.
I think that's all my questions. So thank you so much for speaking with me.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.